Welcome one and all to my quite noisy part of this corner of Yatton this week. I've got a whole bunch of roadworks going on behind me, so if you hear any drilling during this week's YMCast, I can only apologise, but welcome one and all. It is always great to be with you. It's great to be sharing with you in this way, so let's just, as we always do, start in prayer. Heavenly Lord, even though there's whole lots of noise and chaos in this world at the moment, may we know your calming presence. As the waves of our lives brew up into storms, may you come among us and calm the waters. May we know your peace, love and tranquility this day and always. Amen. So we kick off this week with the finale of our four-part series of A Brief History of Methodism. So we arrive in the 21st century, and I hand over to the Reverend Jonathan Hustler.
This has been a rapid and incomplete overview of the history of the Methodist Church over the last 3 centuries. But we now have to ask, where does that leave us in the 21st century? It leaves us, I would say, first of all, with a people called Methodist. A people who would claim to be open-hearted in their sense of community. A people who are still a significant, albeit declining, presence in rural, suburban and urban communities. The Methodist people are a people who intentionally work together as lay and ordained, whose ministers see themselves very much as alongside the laity. And that partnership of lay and ordained is very much symbolised by the presidency and vice presidency of the conference. The president is always a presbyter, the vice president a layperson or deacon. It's symbolised in the significant role that local preachers have in the worship of the Methodist Church. Most Methodist services are taken by lay people rather than by ordained ministers. And it's signified by the important role that lay people have in the governance of the church at every level: local church, circuit, district, and connection. The Methodist people are a people for whom discipleship is important, who remember that the first Methodists met together in classes in order to hold one another to account for their discipleship. That call to discipleship is still symbolised by the annual ticket of membership that all Methodist members are given. Methodists are still encouraged to meet together in fellowship. Few class meetings may remain in the way that they once did, but many Methodists are involved in house groups or Bible study groups, as well as in the worship of their churches. The Methodist people, of course, have seen a vast change in their demography. Now we are a multiracial and multicultural people. I need to remember that the Methodist history that I presented here is very much my Methodist history, the history of the Methodist Church in Britain. It might not be the history of somebody else who comes from another part of Methodism's great global presence. Leaves us secondly with worship that is called Methodist. Hymnody has always been important to Methodists. We like to say, born in song, with the many thousands of verses written by Charles Wesley and the singing of those 18th century Methodists. A few years ago, we published our latest hymn book, Singing the Faith, expressing the continued importance of hymnody as core to our worship. Singing the Faith stands alongside our Methodist worship book, published in 1999. The Methodist worship is shaped both by the preaching tradition of the historic free churches in which, and for Methodism in particular, this was important, the sermon had a central role in worship, and by the liturgies of the Church of England, the Holy Communion service, and morning and evening prayer. Now Methodist people will draw not only on our own Methodist resources, but on other resources such as those of Iona or Taizé in the leading of worship. As part of our worship, the circuit plan remains distinctive. The circuit plan deploying the ministry of local preachers around our churches Sunday by Sunday. And it reminds us that our worship is always shaped by a calendar. And for Methodists, that calendar combines the local and the Catholic. The local, the Harvest Festival, the Sunday School anniversary that remains very important in some places, though perhaps less so than in the early part of the 20th century. And the Catholic calendar, the lectionary that we follow week by week, and which we share with Christians of many other denominations. And Methodists will have noticed the increased use of liturgical colours in our worship, with stoles and sometimes pulpit and table falls. We have thirdly a faith that we call Methodist. As our 1932 Deed of Union makes clear, the Methodist people stand in the mainstream of a broadly Protestant Christianity. We proclaim that ours is an evangelical faith. That is to say that we stand as part of the inheritance of Luther and others of the Protestant Reformation, with an emphasis on the good news of Christ that is to be shared. And the particular Methodist emphasis, which it takes from John and Charles Wesley, is on our Arminianism. That is to say that the evangelical offer of grace is extended to all people. It's a faith that is considered. We have a long tradition in the Methodist Church of scholarship. Wesley, of course, encouraged all his preachers to read and to read widely. There have been many leading university professors who have been Methodists. But Methodism has encouraged scholarship all the way through, not only its ordained ministers, but also many of its local preachers, people who studied faithfully to acquire a deep knowledge of the Christian faith and of the scriptures. And lastly, we are left with a church that we call Methodist. It has to be said that there have always been a few people who resist the notion that Methodism is a church. They would maintain that Methodism was established to be and continues to be primarily a movement. But Methodism established its ecclesial identity firmly in the 19th century. Not to be a church separate from other Christians, but to be committed to ecumenism, part of the Church Catholic. In the early 21st century, we are now a church that is in a covenant relationship with the Church of England, where both denominations are committed to overcoming the remaining obstacles to full and visible unity. The form of church that we have is connectionalism. We are a church in Britain that is governed by our conference. Although since shortly after the Second World War, we have been discussing how we might introduce episcopacy into the Methodist Church, there are no bishops in British Methodism at the moment. Conference effectively is our bishop. The conference meets annually. It consists of a presbyteral session and of a representative session bringing together presbyters, deacons and lay people. Over a period of 8 days in June or early July, it reviews the whole life of the Methodist Church, stations its ministers, and welcomes into full connection those who have been trained and prepared for ministry among us. The connection is arranged in 31 districts, each of which has its own synod. And there are something over 500 circuits. The circuits can vary enormously. Some of them are a handful of churches with 1 or 2 ministers. Others cover whole counties or a greater geographical area. We have now approximately 3,000 ordained presbyters, half of those who are supernumerary, that is to say, who have sat down from their active ministry, and about 300 deacons, again, about half of them supernumerary. But as I said earlier, we remain essentially a church that believes in the partnership of the lay and the ordained, where much of our ministry is exercised through local preachers, through pastoral visitors, and through those who hold office in the various courts of the church. This Methodist Church may be very different from that which the Wesley brothers brought into being in the 18th century, but it is still recognisably its descendant.
Those brief history of Methodism videos have been really interesting to be able to watch, to kind of chart the journey that we've been on as the Methodist Church. And here we now are in 2020 in some rather interesting times. But there's some really interesting projects going on, and it was mentioned briefly by Jonathan, but I want to talk about what is called a Methodist way of life. This has been a pet project by Dr. Roger Walton, who's a former president of the conference, and we're going to just share a short interview that he did with Hella Soyle from the Darlington district, and she's kind of talking about what a Methodist way of life is and ways to get involved with it.
Thank you and welcome to this conversation between myself, Hella Soyle, and Reverend Dr. Roger Walton. Now, Roger is a very experienced person because he's been a chair of district, he's been a president and a principal at a college. He's also an author of a couple of books, and in the last 2 years he's been working with a team of people on a way of life, and the Methodist way of life is kind of developing from that. So I'm very excited for this interview, and hopefully through this you're able to become better informed on what Methodist way of life is and has to offer. Now in the Darlington district, we have already started an online consultation on Methodist way of life, and we're hoping this will continue as we seek to develop Methodist way of life over the next few years. So Roger, would you start us off by kind of telling us what is the Methodist way of life?
Okay, so Methodist way of life is a way of living. It's a way of living your life in the world, which is helped by a simple rule of life. And a kind of rule of life is a set of practices that we aspire to, that we express our Christian faith, the way we live in the world to show that we're followers of Jesus. Now, it's kind of draws on our calling, which will be very familiar to people in the Methodist Church, been around since the year 2000, very widely used and accepted. And it tells us that we're responding to God's love, and we're doing that through 4 patterns: through worship, through learning and caring, through service, and through evangelism. That's the way the Methodist Church is called to live in the 21st century. And this way of life helps people to kind of, in a sense, locate that in their own spirituality, in their everyday practices. And it has a set of questions with it, which are for reflection. The questions sit alongside, as it were, the commitments, and kind of ask you to reflect on where you are and what you're doing. So, for example, in the worship section, it says we'll pray every day, we'll worship with others regularly, we'll look and listen for God. And the questions are to say to us, well, what's happening in your prayer life? What's the pattern? How easy or hard is it? When have you sensed God, or has God felt distant? And so the questions are for us to reflect and actually ideally to share with other people, so we can talk honestly with other people about the joys, the blessings, but also the struggles of our spiritual life.
Well, the Methodist way of life focuses upon accountable discipleship and draws upon deep wells of Christian practice, which is old and new. Could you tell us a little about how these rich traditions have influenced the development of Methodist way of life?
Okay, so I think most people will know that early Methodism put a great deal of emphasis on small groups. Some of the early ones were called bands, and then the class meeting became the way in which everybody who belonged to a Methodist society belonged. So they belonged to the small group, to the class, as part of the society, and then eventually the church that they were part of. And these small groups were intended to help people make the spiritual journey. So it was a place where you could be honest about where you were, the things that had blessed you and helped you, the things that you were struggling with, where you kind of missed the mark, and so on. And others were there to kind of listen, to pray, to support, sometimes to give a bit of encouragement and advice, but largely to create a place where you could kind of get to grips with your own spiritual journey. And I think we wanted to kind of get hold of the essence of that. So I don't think we will see the class meetings again. They were of their time. But there is, I think, for us something really important about being intentional about our spiritual journey and being willing to account to others for the journey that we're taking and how it's going, so that others can pray and support us, and we can pray and support them on the journey, because that kind of journey is often very demanding and not easy. So we do need the help that we can get, and I think in that sense it's informed who we are. And those kind of house groups and small groups and cell groups that have come a long time are kind of other expressions of that same kind of thing. This is in line with that and wants to make use of that.
So Roger, would you be able to tell us why now? Why at this point on our journey do you think Methodist way of life is important for the Methodist Church?
Okay, there's kind of big picture and small picture here. So the big picture is that we are towards the end of Christendom. Now, Christendom's that kind of alliance between state and church, which has gone on almost since Constantine became the first Christian emperor, when the state kind of put its weight behind the church, sometimes for very negative outcomes, sometimes for good. But what's happened in those, kind of most of 1700 years or so, in Europe in particular, is that the state has been shaped with the church in telling people how to be Christian. So I grew up in a non-Christian family, and we didn't go to church. But we knew that you should go to church on Sunday because the shops were closed, because the churches were open, so that whether you were a believer or not a believer, you knew that people should go to church on Sunday. And for many people, that was a way of knowing what it meant to be Christian. You went to church on Sunday, you went to a worship service, and then you had the festivals where there were public holidays, and Whit walks were part of it at one stage, and those occasions which were ordained by the state told you a lot about what it meant to be Christian. Now that's been disappearing. I mean, for the last 100 years it's been disappearing, and it will disappear even more. Sunday is not a non-trading day now. In fact, more people go shopping than almost anything else on Sundays. So with that's gone, and some of the festivals, special times of the year have gone. Christmas stays on because it actually works in with a commercial thing. But I think not many people now outside the church know when Pentecost is or what Pentecost is about. And I think Easter might even go in that direction too if schools reorganize how they teach. So when you haven't got those things outside which tell you how it is to be Christian, you need to know inside. You need to know in your own practices. So a way of life, a rule of life, it is a way of saying this is what it means to live as a Christian. We live like this, and then so that's the kind of now on the big picture that we need to be addressing this in terms of expressing our own identity as followers of Christ, not expecting the state to tell us how to do that. But the small picture, I suppose, is the recent COVID picture. You know, that we've not been able to go to our church buildings, and even when we've gone back, is a very different experience of worship. You know, I took a service on Sunday, I had to wear a face shield, and you know, there were about 20 people in the congregation, all spaced about, and but for many people, that's not been possible at all, and some people are very hesitant about going back into a church building for kind of good reasons, really. And I think that it somehow told us that things that we think express our identity, so going to church, worshipping in a certain way, are not the whole thing. In fact, you know, they may be things that change over time quite radically. So, but what's at the heart of it? And what's at the heart of it is praying, worshipping in some way, challenging injustice, sharing our faith, practicing hospitality. These are the things that are in Methodist way of life. These express who we are. And I think we ought to do that now, in this changing world where Christendom is disappearing and where COVID-19 has told us that we're going to have to be different.
So finally, could you share with us some stories about how Methodist way of life might look like in practice at an individual or a small group or a congregational level?
Yeah, so a couple of things that might be useful. The first is that because Yorkshire West had a go at this as a sort of pilot, we didn't give people too many instructions about what they had to do. We just simply shared this, and a lot of people took them, and many people set up small groups, so 3 or 4 people at most, sometimes even 2, and they set up meetings once a month, and once a month they come together and they look at one of the questions and say, you know, well, how, and each person would share a little bit about where they were in relation to that question and what was happening in their life. Then they pray for each other, and then they, you know, fix to meet in a month's time and look at another question, so that now lots of groups have set up across the country like that during this year, in 3s and 4s, occasionally in 2s, for that kind of sharing. Now, I think that's quite a good expression of it, and I think for many people, you know, to have a prayer partner or a prayer triplet it is a real help, and it's a good place to use this. But it's not the kind of only place. Lots of other ways in which it can be used. So in the congregational setting, it's quite a good thing to say together as a group. So last Sunday I preached a short sermon, and then we said the way of life together as way of responding, saying this is the people of God, this is what it means to be the people of God. And one group I knew in Burley and Wharfdale, they're small groups, which there are about a dozen, end there every time they meet. They might meet about studying a book or doing any other thing, but at the end of when they meet, they say together the way of life, because as they go out, they're saying, this is what we're going to be like in the world. We're going to live like this. So there's that. There's also the whole business of kind of sharing who we are, really. So lots of people say, you know, what are Methodists about? What is it they believe? How are they different? And that, I think it's quite a good thing to say to them, well, this is what we're about. Give them a way of life. Say, this is how we try to live our lives. You know, we this is what we believe is important for the transformation of the world. And so I mean, I think it could be used like that. I think there are other things, and we're preparing a number of resources which are going to be available across this autumn. So the sermon series around each of the commitments, that's going to go onto the website in the autumn as study material, video material, and they can be used in a variety of ways within the life of the church. I think the other thing that's interesting is that some of the new communities that are emerging from our church, you know, sometimes we call them fresh expressions, pioneer communities, and so on. these new patterns of being a Christian community are often using the way of life or something very similar to it as a way of focusing their community's life. This is the people we're about, and so they will say it together, they will talk about it together, they will explore what it means together, in order to sustain their sense of calling to mission and ministry in their locality.
Well, that's it. I mean, thank you, Roger, for your grace and willingness to come and share with us. And we really appreciate your passion and enthusiasm for this. And I mean, we're really enthusiastic in Darlington District as well to take this forward. If anyone has any questions or further comments, then please do not hesitate to get in touch with me, and you can find my email address on the district website. But this concludes our interview. Thank you and goodbye.
So thank you very much for coming along and sharing this journey with us on YMCast this week. As always, it's been brilliant to be with you. If you want to get in touch with us, either please do send me an email or do use the hashtag YMCcast. It's always great to be able to hear from you and hear your reflections. So I hope you have a good week, and I will see you soon.